Welcome to a deep dive, you guys, into Think Big. You know that book by Ben Carson with Cecil Murphy?
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting, this book. I think it's resonated with so many different types of people.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're in high school, you're trying to figure out, what to do with your life. If you're a business professional and you want to, kind of up your game,
Yeah.
uh, it seems like it's really spoken to a lot of people.
It has. It's got a lot of really great advice in there. And I think, something that really comes through in the book that we'll talk about today is, the influence of others. And also just this, mandate to really give your best.
Right.
To really work hard and try to achieve excellence.
Yeah. So in this deep dive, the book goes into, a lot of the people who influenced Ben Carson, and then it goes into some of the principles that he learned along the way.
Mm.
And that's really what we're going to focus on today. So, if you're listening, you can take these insights and hopefully apply them to your own life.
Yeah. There's a great quote in the book, actually right at the beginning, and it's by William Ellery Channing.
Oh.
And he says, "It is chiefly through books that we enjoy intercourse with superior minds." So, reading is really a way to connect with, the great minds of the past. And also, I think just, people who are ahead of you in some way in their journey,
Right.
who can teach you things
Right.
and share their experience with you.
And if we're talking about, people who have influenced Ben Carson, the book really goes into the influence of his mother, Sonia Carson.
Yeah.
And, I think it's really inspiring to see, just how much she believed in her sons,
Yeah.
even though they were, facing a lot of challenges.
Yeah. There's this great anecdote in the book about when he was in, I think it was like 5th grade, and he gets this terrible report card, like really, really bad grades.
Right.
And, his mom's reaction to this is so interesting. She basically tells him, look, you've got a good brain that God gave you. You need to use it. You need to do better.
Right.
And it's not even, really, I think, encouragement as much as it is just an expectation. Like she just expects him to do better.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of, unwavering belief from a parent is really powerful.
Yeah. And it wasn't just words. I mean, she actually took action.
Yeah.
She basically took away the TV.
Yeah.
Or limited drastically. And then she said, you guys have to read 2 books a week.
Wow.
And they had to write book reports. So she really shifted their focus.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like she took away that passive entertainment.
Right.
And replaced it with something that was really going to, kind of get their brains working and get them curious about stuff.
Yeah.
And, the progression of this reading is so interesting, too. It starts with animals, then plants, then minerals,
Right.
then rocks.
Right.
Which you think, okay, well, rocks are pretty boring. But then
he actually applied it. I mean, because he was reading about rocks.
Right.
And they lived near the railroad tracks. And he was looking at the rocks that were like crushed by the railroad tracks.
Right.
And he's like, no, that's that type of rock. That's that type of rock. So he was already like,
that's so cool.
applying this knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, it just shows you that even if something seems, kind of abstract or obscure, it can become relevant, know, in your life. And then, it really culminates in 5th grade with 2 events that I think really demonstrate the power of this reading habit. The first is the spelling bee.
Okay.
And the second is this incident in science class. So what do you think is really significant about the spelling bee?
Well, I think it's significant because, for someone who is, struggling academically,
Right.
to all of a sudden be in a spelling bee and know the word agriculture, and the kid who everyone thought was like the smartest kid in the class
Right.
didn't know it, I think that was a huge confidence boost. And I think that that's so crucial for like young people, especially when they're struggling in school, to have those early wins.
Yeah.
Where they can say, wow, I can do this.
Yeah. It's that reinforcement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like you're struggling, you don't think you're good at this, and then all of a sudden you have this success, and it's
Right.
like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe I'm not so bad at this after all.
Right. And then there's this incident in science class
Yeah. So tell me about this incident.
with the rock.
Yeah.
So he's in science class, and the teacher, Mr. Jake,
Mr. J.
holds up this rock, and he's like, does anybody know what kind of rock this is? And immediately Ben Carson's like, that's obsidian.
Right.
And nobody else in the class knew. And I mean, even the kids who were considered,
smart.
Yeah, but they're smart kids, didn't know.
Right.
And Mr. Jake, was so enthusiastic in his praise
Yeah.
for Ben Carson knowing the answer.
Yeah.
And for Ben Carson, this was like a huge revelation. He realized that reading was the way out of ignorance. And that's when things really changed for him. He's like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm not the class dunce. I can actually be smart.
Yeah. So it's like a total shift in his self-perception.
Right.
He no longer sees himself as the dumb kid.
Right.
He sees himself as someone who can learn,
Right.
who can be smart,
Right.
who can excel. But then, of course, with this newfound academic success comes another challenge, which is arrogance.
Right.
Right. So have you ever felt that, like when you've kind of overcome some obstacle in your life and then you're kind of tempted to, rub it in people's faces?
Yeah, totally. Like, look at me now.
Yeah.
You were wrong about me.
Yeah, exactly. And he's realizing that he's smarter than a lot of people.
Right.
And he wants to kind of, prove him wrong.
Yeah.
Show off his knowledge a little bit.
Right. He's oversharing a bit.
Yeah. And so then his mom, she kind of catches on to this. And, she always had this saying, which was, do your best.
Right.
And I think it's so interesting because it wasn't about being better than everyone else. It was about just doing your best.
Right.
Right. And that's a really subtle but important distinction, I think. And it's something that, he kind of struggles with for a while, but eventually he comes to understand, that true achievement is about personal excellence.
Right.
It's about striving to be better than you were yesterday, and not necessarily better than everyone else.
Right.
And, even later on in his career, when he's a surgeon, people are coming up to him and thanking him, families of patients are saying, thank you so much for saving my loved one's life. He's very cognizant of the fact that his success is not just his own doing, right? There are so many other people who have contributed to his success. And so he has to constantly guard against that pride, It's really interesting. So, that's kind of the first part of the book. And I think the main takeaway there is, just this idea of always striving to do your best.
Right.
Which was something that his mom really instilled in him.
Right.
And then also just the transformative power of reading. Right. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that he didn't do this in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right? He had a lot of help along the way.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to part 2, which is the influence of key individuals.
Yeah.
It's that saying, it takes a village.
Right.
And it's so true. No matter how talented or driven you are, you can't achieve your full potential alone.
Yeah.
You need mentors.
Yeah.
You need inspirers. You need influencers. And Ben Carson's story is full of examples of that, starting, even in his early life with his teachers.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Mr. Jake.
Yeah.
That incident where he knew what that obsidian rock was.
Right.
And nobody else in the class knew.
Right.
Mr. Jake invited him back after class. And he's like, hey, let's talk about your rack collection. And I think for someone like Ben Carson, who was, maybe not getting a lot of attention at school.
Yeah.
For a teacher to take that extra time and, just to recognize him for his knowledge. Yeah. I think it had a huge impact on him.
It's personalized attention.
Yeah.
And he also let him work with the animals in the classroom. He had all these animals and fish and stuff. And so he let him kind of take care of them and, feed them and stuff. And that was really significant for him.
Yeah. And then you have Mr. McCotter, who, was another teacher.
Yeah, their teacher.
Who was very encouraging of Ben Carson.
Right.
And really helped him to feel like he could talk to him about anything. And, especially for, a young boy who, maybe didn't have a lot of strong male role models in his life. To have a teacher who's like that.
Yeah.
Who's so supportive.
Yeah.
And, who believes in him. And then Lemuel Dokes.
Lemuel Dokes.
This is the band director.
Yeah.
And he's kind of this no-nonsense figure. Yeah. Really tough.
Yeah.
But he clearly cared about his students. And he was really proud of them when they were, achieving things in music. And, Ben Carson actually got a music scholarship to Interlochen, which is like a really prestigious summer program for music. And Mr. Dokes actually told him, don't go. I think you should focus on your, scientific or medical aspirations.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Like he recognized his talent and he was clearly proud of him for getting that scholarship.
Right.
But he also saw that his true strengths and his future probably lay somewhere else.
Yeah.
Which is, I think a really good mentor is someone who can see the potential in you that you might not even see in yourself, and who can guide you in the right direction.
Yeah. And I think, when you're young, it's really hard to see that.
Yeah.
And then, he goes to Yale. And there's not as much, mentoring in the traditional sense.
Right.
In that part of the book.
Yeah.
But he does find a community.
Yeah.
At the church. The Mount Zion Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Right.
And they really embrace him and they welcome him into their homes. And, they have him over for dinner and stuff. And I think that's so important. When you're away from home for the first time.
Yeah.
To have that sense of community.
Yeah. So have you found community to be helpful in your life?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like when I moved to a new city, it was really the people that I met.
Yeah.
They made it feel like home.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, he goes on to medical school and his residency. And, the mentoring continues in a different way. So one of his mentors in medical school is Dr. James Tarrant. And he describes Dr. Tarrant as this incredibly inspiring figure.
Right.
He just had this amazing work ethic. And the way he presented information was so captivating that Ben Carson just felt really privileged to be in his presence.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's like he was in awe of him.
Yeah. And then, of course, in his residency, he had Dr. George Udvar-Helly.
Right.
Who was his residency director. And
big personality.
Yeah. And he really emphasized this idea of treating the patient as an individual, not just as a collection of symptoms, He would always quiz the residents on medical history.
Right.
And he would really push them to think deeply about each case, And then in the lab, he had Dr. Jim Anderson, who was his supervisor. And Dr. Anderson really taught him the principles of efficiency and effectiveness in research. And so what impact do you think that had on Ben Carson's career?
Well, I think, under Dr. Anderson's guidance, he was able to complete this research project in 6 months.
Wow.
That was supposed to take 2 years.
That's incredible.
And I think that really showed him, the value of being efficient and effective. And it also probably, gave him a taste of what it's like to work in academic medicine.
Right.
Which, may have influenced his decision to stay at Johns Hopkins. And then he goes to Australia for a year to study. And he meets 2 more really influential figures in the field of neurosurgery.
Yeah.
Dr. Brian Stokes and Dr. Richard Vaughan. And these 2 surgeons were very different in their approach.
Yeah.
So Dr. Stokes was very flamboyant. And he was incredibly skilled. But he also had a sense of humor that was often hidden. He didn't always show it.
Right.
And then Dr. Vaughan was kind of the opposite. He was very quiet. But he had this incredible surgical skill and intuition. And so it's really interesting to see how these 2 very different people could both achieve excellence in their field.
Yeah, it's like 2 different pathways to mastery.
Yeah.
And then back at Johns Hopkins, he has a fellow resident, Dr. Art Wong.
Right.
Who he works very closely with.
Yeah.
Particularly on these shunt surgeries.
These are really delicate procedures.
Right.
And their teamwork was so good that the nurses would specifically request Art's assistance.
Wow.
When Ben Carson was doing these procedures.
Wow.
And then, unfortunately, Art dies in a whirlpool accident, which is really sad. And the book really talks about the impact that had on the whole department. It just shows how, even in a high-pressure environment like that, people really form these strong bonds.
Yeah. It really humanizes it, doesn't it? Like, it's not just about the work.
Right. It's about the people.
Right.
And there's, it's not just the surgeons who are important. There's all these other people who work behind the scenes who are essential to the success of any medical institution.
Right.
So, have you ever met someone in like a support role who just made everything better?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, like a receptionist or, a secretary or a nurse, that can make all the difference.
Yeah.
So the book actually talks about Georgia Simpson, who was a receptionist in the clinic, and she was just amazing at calming down upset patients, and just making the clinic a more positive place.
Right.
And there's actually this contrast in the book between Georgia Simpson and another receptionist who just kind of agreed with a patient who was complaining, you know? And it's like, well, that's not really helpful, you know? And then there was Pat Brothers, who was his secretary.
Right.
And she was actually instrumental in him getting hired in the first place. And then, you know, she just did an amazing job of keeping everything organized.
Right.
And running the office smoothly. And then there's Carol James, who was a nurse practitioner, and she had this amazing intuitive understanding of patients and their families. And she was really good at explaining things to them.
Right.
And, you know, sometimes she had to be the mean lady.
Right.
Because she would tell people, you know, look, this is what you need to do, and this is what you don't need to do.
Right.
And then there's Mary Kay Conover, who was one of the first nurse practitioners at Hopkins. And she was just a really advanced clinician. You know, she was very thoughtful and thorough. And then Carolyn Childs, who was the head nurse in the operating room.
Right.
She was really instrumental in the separation surgery of the Binder twins, which was a very complex procedure.
Right.
And she did all this meticulous planning. And she even did these visualization exercises with Ben Carson before the surgery.
Right.
And, you know, she was really the one who kept everything running smoothly.
Yeah. The book refers to nurses as the infantry in the fight against disease, you know?
Yeah. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway here is that success is not just about individual brilliance. It's about a collective effort. It's about everyone working together and supporting each other. So this brings us to part 3, which is where the book really gets into the principles of thinking big and giving your best.
Right.
And I think the first thing that really stands out is this idea of doctors learning from their patients, which is something that you might not always think about. Right. You know, we tend to think of doctors as the experts who are imparting knowledge to their patients. But, you know, the book really emphasizes that doctors are constantly learning from their patients as well. Right. You know, every patient presents a unique challenge and a unique opportunity to learn. And then there's this theme of risk-taking, which is really interesting in the context of neurosurgery. Yeah. Because, you know, the stakes are so high, right? But the book argues that sometimes you have to take risks in order to give a dying person a chance to live. And so there's all these examples in the book of these really high-risk surgeries that Ben Carson performed. And, you know, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But, you know, he was always willing to push the boundaries and try new things. There's a couple of specific cases that stand out. There's David, who had a brainstem tumor. There was this set of twins who had hydrocephalus. Right. It's you know, a buildup of fluid in the brain. And then there was Robert Pressman, who had this malignant sinus tumor. And all of these cases were really, really challenging. But, you know, he was able to achieve some pretty incredible results.
Yeah, and Robert Pressman's case is especially interesting because, you know, he had this really rough time after the surgery, and then all of a sudden he just made this miraculous recovery. Yeah. And nobody could really explain it.
Yeah. It was like beyond their medical understanding. Right. And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about medicine is that, you know, there's still so much that we don't know. Yeah. And sometimes you just have to accept that things happen that we can't fully explain.
You know? Yeah.
Another really important principle in the book is this idea of having a positive attitude. Right. And, you know, there's this great story about Tony, who had a recurring brain tumor. And statistically, he was not supposed to survive. But he was just so optimistic and positive. And he ended up living for much longer than anyone expected. Right. So I think it's important to clarify, though, that it's not about forcing yourself to be positive all the time. Right. Yeah. It's more about just choosing to focus on the positive aspects of your situation. Right. And And, there's always going to be challenges.
Right.
But it's how you choose to frame those challenges that really makes a difference.
Right.
And then the book talks about talent. And it makes this really bold statement, which is that everybody has talent, right? Not just some people, everybody. But the problem is that a lot of people's talents are either undeveloped or they're just not recognized. And so, I think that's something to really think about. Like, what are your talents? What are you good at? And how can you develop those talents?
Yeah.
So there's this really inspiring story in the book about A.G. Gaston, who was a Black businessman.
And he faced a lot of prejudice. But he was able to overcome that by recognizing his talent for business and using it to help his community. And he had this great saying, which was green power, which was basically just a way of saying, I'm not going to make excuses. I'm going to take what I'm good at and I'm going to use it to help others.
Right.
And so, I think it's a really powerful example of how to think about talent. And, the book also talks about the human brain and how incredibly complex it is. And it makes the point that if God gave us these brains, then we should be using them.
Right.
Right. We should be developing our talents. We should be learning new things.
Right.
And so, I think it's really important to think about what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, and then to try to find a career that aligns with those things.
It's like Johann Sebastian Bach, right? He was just born with this incredible musical gift. And, he developed that gift and he became one of the greatest composers of all time.
Right.
So, I think we all have that potential to achieve greatness in our own way.
Right.
And it's just a matter of finding what we're good at and then developing it. So there's this great anecdote in the book about Ben Carson speaking to a group of middle school students. And at first, they're kind of a tough crowd. They're not really paying attention. But then he starts talking about his journey and he starts talking about the brain. And all of a sudden they're hooked. They're asking questions. They're engaged. And at the end, they give him a standing ovation. And so I think it just shows that, everybody can be fascinated by knowledge if it's presented in the right way.
Right.
And then there's this other example in the book of Raphael, who was a lab worker. And he was just incredibly thorough in his work. And, he wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't a scientist. But he was still giving his best in his role. And I think that's really important to remember, that no matter what you do, you can always strive for excellence. And then the book talks about honesty. And there's this great contrast in the book between Ben Carson's experience in pre-med and his experience with his Uncle Henry. So in pre-med, he had this classmate who graduated magna cum laude, but he was dishonest. And then he had his Uncle Henry, who didn't have a lot of education, but he was just inherently honest. He was a very truthful person.